I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, whether it's Habakkuk or Habakkuk. The books of Habakkuk and Zephaniah, which stand back to back, Habakkuk and Zephaniah, are both 3 chapters in length, and they both have the same theme. All right? What was the book that, what was the new book that we made up in the English canon of the Bible last week that deals with the fall or the doom of Nineveh? What? Jonahum. Right. Okay, that's a good way to remember how those 2 books relate. Jonahum, the book of Jonah and the book of Nahum, together have the theme of Nineveh's doom. Now, Jonah prophesied 100 years before Nahum, approximately, and his message was successful to that generation of Ninevites. But then 100 or 150 years later, Nahum comes along and pronounces final doom. The books of Habakkuk and Zephaniah both concern the coming of the Babylonians against Judah. So they have in view the fall of Judah, God's judgment of Judah. Lockyer calls Habakkuk the man who caressed the people. The man who caressed the people. Habakkuk's name means embrace, or he that embraces. And when we look at his book, it's as if the man is a very sensitive man, and he, while he does pronounce God's judgment on Judah for their sinfulness against God, at the same time he has a longing, an earnest longing for the people to come to the Lord. And he's very distraught himself. He was very distraught that God would use the Babylonians, such a wicked nation, to bring judgment on God's people. And he didn't quite understand how God's love for his people could be correlated to God's holy justice. Habakkuk was wrestled with the same problem that many, many people wrestle with. And I've been preaching on this several times lately, and so it's fresh in my mind. The age-old problem of how you reconcile evil in the universe of a good God. How, if God is good and loving and fair and righteous, how can he allow evil and sin and wickedness and rebellion? How can he allow Satan to operate if he's good? Why doesn't he just banish it? This is a real problem, isn't it? Unsaved people love to throw that one in your face if you try to witness to them. They say, well, if they're such a loving God, well then, and they go, they state it however they wish. How come there are so many refugees? How come the little kids starve in Ethiopia? They're really talking about the same issue, evil in the universe of a good God. This is, in essence, one of the themes of the book of Habakkuk. Phillips calls Habakkuk the prophet with a problem. The prophet with a problem. He calls him the doubting Thomas of the Old Testament. So let's look at Habakkuk tonight. The author of the book is clearly Habakkuk. Chapter 1, verse 1, the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. In verse 2 of chapter 2, Habakkuk writes, "The Lord answered me and said, Write the vision and make it plain upon tablets, that he may run that readeth it." In chapter 3, verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. So it's very clear from beginning to last in this book that Habakkuk wrote the book. It records his own prayer. He was clearly commissioned to write. There's not much problem with it. Unger says that the critics don't even try to change. Well, he says they do. They try to say that the book was written later on in the Greek period, but he says it's just an arbitrary assumption. He says that they change a word in chapter 1, verse 6, the critics. The critics read it this way: "For lo, I raise up the Cypriots, that bitter and hasty nation." He says there's no grounds for them changing the word. If it was the Cypriots, that refers to people from the island of Cyprus, who came from Ionia in Greece, and the critics try to make this book try to say that the book was written much later than it was in the Chaldean period, or the pre-Chaldean period. Herbert Lockyer says that Habakkuk was the last prophet before the destruction of Jerusalem. Not quite sure how he says that for sure.
Lockyer?
Yeah, Herbert Lockyer says he was the last prophet before the destruction of Jerusalem. If that's the case, then the prophet Zephaniah, who was a contemporary of Habakkuk, the prophet Zephaniah, his prophecy actually precedes Zephaniah's prophecy.
Before Judah and Jerusalem?
Both. They fell at the same time. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah. Okay. So if Habakkuk is the last prophet before 605, when Nebuchadnezzar came down the first time against Judah, then Zephaniah is just before him. We'll come to that. And it's possible that this is the case. Somewhere there's a reference. Yes, in chapter 1, verse 5. I didn't write it down, so I couldn't find it here. In chapter 1, verse 5 of the book, he gives God's message: "Behold among the nations, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days." That is, in Habakkuk's days and in the days of the people to whom he's writing. "In your days, which you will not believe though it be told you." That phrase, "in your days," indicates that Habakkuk lived scarcely a generation before this first invasion. Perhaps he lived even at the time of it. All right? So he was like contemporary with the time when Daniel was captivated. Phillips puts an actual date on it. He says that this man therefore wrote between 619 and 610 BC. Now, how Phillips doesn't explain in the commentary I have how he gets his dates. Unger says that Habakkuk prophesied in the Neo-Babylonian era about 625 BC. Well, that's not that's not all that much. Unger says he prophesied 625. Phillips says he prophesied 619 to 610. Well, they only differ by 6 years. And if the Babylonians invaded in 605, which we know from secular history they did, that would have placed him within 20 years of the first Babylonian invasion.
So they're trying to say that his prophecy was complete, the last full and complete prophecy before the fall of Babylon, because there were prophecies involved in the prophecy right in the fall of Babylon.
Yeah.
But not from Babylon, but a capture from Babylon.
Lockyer said that he's the last prophet to prophesy before the Babylonians came.
Yeah, because there was a period there during the Babylonians that we had these other guys.
Daniel and Ezekiel and who's the other one? Daniel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah all prophesied during the exile.
Yeah, so this is a complete period.
This is pre-exilic. All right, does that help now? Unger, even though he says 625, he says it's possible to place this book even as early as the reign of Manasseh, about 650 BC. I mean, as far as the details that we have in this book, there's not enough specific things said about the time in which Habakkuk himself was actually writing. Like, he doesn't tell us too much about his surroundings, so we don't know for sure. He could have been 25 years earlier than that even.
Manasseh, was he not the guy that saw Isaiah in half?
Yes.
But wasn't Isaiah before Jeremiah?
Yes.
So he was at the same time then as Isaiah?
No, Jeremiah was after Habakkuk.
Right.
All right. Isaiah prophesied that Israel would fall.
Right.
Okay. So Isaiah was in the tradition says that he was killed by Manasseh.
Right.
Unger is saying that Habakkuk could have written anywhere from the time of Isaiah, right up. This is approximately 650, and he says that he could have, even as down to 610. There's a 40-year stretch there that his predictions fit into this period of Jewish history. That's right. And then Jeremiah predicted, he prophesied after this happened, or right at the time when this was taking place.
Is that Habakkuk could have lived when Isaiah was alive?
Possibly.
Probably could have seen Jeremiah and Daniel as well.
Yeah, I doubt if he could have seen them all.
No, but I mean around that same time.
Yeah. Right. If he was earlier, then he might have known Isaiah. If he was later, he might have known Jeremiah. We're just not too sure. Okay. But Lockyer thinks he was a contemporary of Jeremiah, so Lockyer places him later. Okay. All right. A few things that we can learn about Habakkuk, talking about the major characters in the book. We'll get into the contents in a moment, but I just want to give you some background stuff. Habakkuk is clearly the major character in the book. He's a prophet, 1:1 and 3:1. He calls himself a prophet twice in the book. He was a sensitive man. In chapter 1, verse 2, "O Lord," he says, "how long shall I cry and you will not hear, even cry out to thee of violence and you will not save?" Verse 12, "Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction." He just couldn't understand why God wouldn't answer his cry and why he would allow wicked people like the Babylonians to come. He was very sensitive. Chapter 2, verse 1, he was a burden for Israel. He says, I will stand upon my watch, I will set myself upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me and what I shall answer when I am reproved. He was willing to put his own life on the line, as it were, as an intermediary between God and Israel. He was burdened for the people. In fact, that's what he calls it, the burden which Habakkuk the prophet had seen. His message weighed heavily upon him. I already alluded in verse 2 of chapter 2 to the fact that he was divinely commissioned to write. And from the stuff that we see in chapter 3, some commentators have suggested that he was possibly a priest. That is, a Levite involved in the musical ministry of the temple. For example, Lockyer says that Habakkuk was a Levitical chorister. He talks about verse 1 of chapter 3, the prayer of Habakkuk the prophet upon Shigionoth. That's a reference to musical instruments. Right? It sort of, doesn't that sound a little bit like the Psalms? Psalm of David upon Northland, the Psalm of David upon Shigionoth, the Psalm of David upon, I can give you a few examples. If I can find them here. I'm looking to try to find them again. Oh yeah, to the chief musician upon Ayalek Shahar. I guess to the chief musician upon Gittib, to the chief musician upon Northland, to the chief musician upon Sheminith. They're all Hebrew words for different kinds of musical instruments. And so, because Habakkuk opens his third chapter like this, some people have suggested that perhaps he was a musician, a Levite. Okay? Lockyer says he was contemporary with Jeremiah. He very much like the prophet Jeremiah in his spirituality and his personal relationship with God. Lockyer points out in another commentary that according to Jewish tradition, Habakkuk was the son of the Shunammite woman that was restored by Elijah. Now, on what basis they would say that, I have no idea. But so I'm not even going to repeat it. For example, Unger says that another legend in the apocryphal legend of Bel and the Dragon, as part of the Apocrypha, it refers to Habakkuk as the son of Jesus of the tribe of Levi. So much for tradition, right? One says he's the son of the Shunammite woman that was raised up to life again from the dead by Elijah. Another tradition says he was of the tribe of Levi. Now, Habakkuk is the main he's the writer of the book, he's the main character. God, however, is very much stressed in this book. 72 times in the book of Habakkuk God is referred to. Some of his titles. Doesn't this remind you a little bit of the book of Nahum?
72.
72 times. Nahum was very much impressed with the person and character of God. And so is Habakkuk. He calls God, some of the titles he uses, the Lord my God, my Holy One, Almighty God, the God of my salvation. Some of those are really... Chapter 1, verse 12 has a couple of good titles. That's a key verse for some of the titles.
Which one?
Chapter 1, verse 12. He calls him the Lord of hosts in chapter 2, 13. He calls him the Holy One in chapter 3, verse 3. And in the second last verse of the book, chapter 3:18, he calls him the God of my salvation. This man had an intimate relationship with God. All kinds of attributes. There's over a dozen attributes of God mentioned in the book. I don't have time to go through them tonight. Right? As far as the geographical references in the book of Habakkuk, I've already told you that he was a prophet to Judah. And the reason I say that is because of the judgment that he refers to in this book, chapter 1, verse 6. He refers to God raising up the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. Well, we know from the book of Jeremiah, and from Micah and Amos and these other prophets that the Chaldeans or the Babylonians were the ones that came against the southern tribe. They had nothing to do with the northern 10 tribes of Israel. Okay? So, therefore, Habakkuk is predicting the doom of Judah. Verse 10, he refers to the kings and the princes in, that the Chaldeans would fight against. That doesn't determine it too much. But chapter 2, verse 8, in verse 17, the violence of Lebanon shall cover thee, the spoil of beasts which made them afraid, because of men's blood of the violence of the land, of the city, and all that dwell in there. He doesn't seem to be too specific in this. He's not nearly as specific as Zephaniah is regarding. But so I think the key verse to identifying the focus of the judgment is in verse 6 of chapter 1. However, the book is worldwide in scope in chapter 2, 14, and 20. In chapter 2, verses 14 and 20. It looks forward into the millennial day. You know, someday God is going to establish His universal kingdom. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Verse 20, the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. And before we leave the geography, we have to mention that there are several references in the book to other nations, but they're only mentioned by way of historical review. Let me put it this way, that the third chapter in this book is a prayer. It's like a psalm, basically. And it's much like Psalm 105 and 106 and 107 of David. Historical reviews. Are you aware of that many of the Psalms are historical? Basically, they review God's leading the people out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and then they take them against the Rephidim, and God kept them from the Amalekites, and God gave them His law at Sinai, and God fed them quail in the wilderness, and right? He took them into that good land, and He destroyed the nations before them. The Psalms are several of the Psalms. There's about a half a dozen Psalms that are basically a synthesis of Jewish history, right? And what Habakkuk does here is he likewise refers to verse 3, Teman and Mount Paran, referring to God's former protection over the nation when He was bringing them from Egypt into the Promised Land. Cushan and Midian in verse 7, referring to the nations of the southeast, that God protected them. Verse 11, he talks about the sun and moon stood still in their habitation. What does that remind you of, historically? The story of Joshua. Remember, Joshua routed the Amalekites. Was it the Amalekites? Yeah, it was the whole. It was his southern campaign. And Joshua led the people into the Promised Land. He went to Jericho, and then he went first divide and conquer. He went against right in the center of the land. Took him about I think it was about a 2 weeks thing, right? And then it took him a week to come down here in all this Amalekite country, and this is where the battle of where he prayed and asked God to make the moon stand still in the valley of Ajalon. That's what this is referring to, you know. And so Habakkuk is going back in his mind's eye into Jewish history and reviewing God's victories, God's sovereignty in Jewish history. Chapter 3, verse 15. He's not very chronological when he's doing this. Thou didst walk through the sea with thine horses through the heap of great waters. He's going back here, the crossing of the Dead Sea. All right, so there are a lot of geographical references, but most of them are historical references backwards. There's at least one really good reference to the millennium in chapter 2, verse 14. The whole earth will know the Lord. And chapter 1, verse 6 is the key verse that helps us identify the focus that the book was written against Judah.
That's
1:6. Okay, any questions before we do that? Now, what is the message? What is the main theme or the message of the book of Habakkuk? I've already mentioned it, but to summarize it for your notes, the message of Habakkuk is basically that God is going to judge Judah by the coming of the Babylonians. I want us to stop and read chapter 1, verse 5 through 13. And I'll start, and then we'll go to Steve and Ron and Glenn and Blair, Tracy, back up to me, okay? Behold, among the nations in regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you.
Lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation, which will march through the breadth of the land, possess the dwelling places that are not theirs.
They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and dignity shall proceed of themselves.
Their horses are also swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from far. They shall fly as the eagle that hastes to eat.
They shall come full of violence, with their faces is forward, and they shall gather the captives as a single.
They shall scoff at the kings and at the princes, and the princes shall be scorned unto them. They shall deride every stronghold, for they shall eat them and take it.
Then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and repent, including this his power unto his God.
Imputing unto his God. Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, thou hast ordained them for judgment, and Almighty God, thou hast established them for correction.
Thou art of purer eyes to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that build treacherous, and holdest thy tongue when the wicked devoureth the man that is more righteous than he.
All right? So this is basically telling the Jews that they're going to be invaded. And yet he names the people that are going to invade them. And he mentions Lebanon, verse 17 of chapter 2. The Babylonians, Babylon is over here off this map. Everybody got it? Okay, it's way northeast. It's about 900 miles northeast of Jerusalem. All right? Now they just didn't come in a straight line as a crow flies. Why? Well, it's possible because we know from history that the Babylonian armies did march, but normally they didn't cross. What is this here? It's desert. And they only crossed the desert when they were in real extremity. The only reason the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar crossed the desert in, I think it was the second or the third invasion, was because they got news that there was a coup taking place back in Babylon, so they had to get there the fastest way possible. So he just forced the march straight as an arrow. Okay. But ordinarily, they followed the Fertile Crescent along where the people were, and where they could live off the land, where stuff grew. Right? And so they came down against Jerusalem from the north, through Lebanon. The violence of Lebanon. They came down. So that's the message of the book. It's a message of doom. Key words and phrases to the book. 6 times we read of the word violence. Chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, and 9. Chapter 2, verse 8 and 17. There are also words like strife and contention and iniquity and grievance and spoiling. Habakkuk's vocabulary focused on wickedness. 4 times in chapter 2 he uses the word woe. Let me read those verses. Verse 9, woe to him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Verse 12, woe to him that buildeth a town with blood, and establishes a city by iniquity. Verse 15, woe to him that giveth his neighbor drink, that puttest thy wineskin to him, and makest him drunk also, that thou mayest look on their nakedness. Verse 19, woe to him that saith to the wood, awake, to the dumb stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there is no bread at all within it. In chapter 2, the woes that are pronounced in this book are against Israel. The woes are pronounced against Israel because of their idolatry, their materialism, their injustice, their immorality. Each one of these woes are connected to a different sin. In fact, it dawns on me now that I read this verse in Habakkuk 2:15 that when we were studying the book of Genesis one time, remember the story of Noah? How that after the flood he became a farmer and he grew grapes and he got drunk in his tent, and his younger son went in there and looked on his father's nakedness, and then Noah passed judgment on Canaan for looking on him when he was drunk and uncovered in his tent. A cross-reference that I was given when we studied through that was Habakkuk 2:15. Woe to him that giveth his neighbor drink, that putteth his wineskin to him and makest him drunk, in order to be immoral with that person. Right? Maybe that's why Noah judged his son Canaan, because it wasn't just accidental that Noah got drunk, but his younger son got him drunk just for that purpose. Now that, you may think that's reading into the story, but there was no question that at this time in Jewish history that it was quite common. That people were very immoral and they were taking advantage of people this way. So, woes upon Israel. Key thing. O Lord, 6 times in the book. Habakkuk is a man of prayer. Chapter 1, verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry? Chapter 1, verse 12. Art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God? O Lord, you has ordained these people for judgment. Chapter 3, verse 2. O Lord, I have heard thy speech and was afraid. O Lord, revive thy work in the midst of the years. And so forth. Habakkuk. By the way, I think those words are key words because they show us what to do when you face a real problem. What did Habakkuk do? Did he throw his hands up in the air and say, hey, I can handle this, and he took off? Did he reject his faith? No. In this case, this man was a man of faith, and so his problem drove him to his knees and asking God for a solution. And that's one of the quotable quotes that I have for this book. John Phillips says that one of the valuable lessons from the book of Habakkuk is that instead of abandoning his faith when faced with seemingly insolvable problems, Habakkuk took it to God. That's the lesson. Habakkuk illustrates that faith is not something. Faith is something that is very practical. Lockyer says that Habakkuk has been called the prophet of faith. The prophet of faith. And I think that's a very fitting. Of all the titles that I have given you tonight about Habakkuk, I would suggest that you keep that one. So he's the prophet of faith. For 2 reasons. Number 1, he demonstrated faith himself.
People say he was a prophet of faith.
The prophet of faith.
And why does Phillips call him the doubting Thomas in the Old Testament?
because of the perplexity that he had. Like, he wrestled, well, it seems contradictory, but it really isn't. In his head, Habakkuk was faced with a real dilemma. And it's actually a twofold dilemma. Why did God not seem to do anything against against Judah? Why did he seem to let them go? Like, why didn't he intervene? Why did he do something? This guy lived in days like we are. Why does God let the church in Canada, the United States, and in the Western world, why does he let the church just fall apart? It looks like it's falling apart. In many respects, it does. Why does he allow ministers of God to fall and become public spectacles that bring disrepute to Christians all over the world? Why? This is very similar. Why do you let your people, God, act the way they do? That's one dilemma that Habakkuk had. The other dilemma was why use godless people to do your business? Like, why use the Babylonians of all people to bring judgment on Israel? He couldn't understand how God would use such godless people. Babylon, Chaldea, was the cradle of idolatry.
Why does God do that? Why does God let Judah go and let his church go and ministers? Why does he do that?
Yes.
Chapter 2 in this book answers the question. Chapter 2 in the book of Habakkuk shows us that there are two or three aspects to the answer. Verse 2 and 3. Let's just read it. The Lord answered me, Habakkuk said, and he said, write. Why? Verse 3, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it. It's an interesting statement. Though it tarry. In other words,
He doesn't get you now, he'll get you later.
That's right. Habakkuk, I want you to write this today. And I want you to realize that there's going to be yet an extended period of time before this stuff actually takes place. It shows us one of the principles that governs the way that God acts. Why does God do things the way he does? Why does he allow evil to win? And why does he allow his own people to sin? I never put it that way before, but why does he do that? Well, number one, the fact of the matter is that God has his own timetable. Okay, now it's not man's timetable, it's God's timetable is his own timetable. He doesn't do things according to our schedule. So let's recognize that whenever we ask the question why, we are actually challenging sovereignty. See? An extension of this, a good illustration of this argument is you read Romans chapter 9, verses about 14 to 22. And the Apostle Paul in this chapter, I realize maybe I'm deviating from the chapter, but I'll come back to it. In Romans chapter 9, the Apostle Paul uses the illustration of Pharaoh. God raised up Pharaoh and he says, I have raised you up to show my glory. Right? And then Paul puts himself in the shoes of his Jewish listeners, and he says, I'm sure that some of you people are wondering, well, if God raised up Pharaoh and hardened Pharaoh's heart, what right does God have to judge Pharaoh if Pharaoh's will has nothing to do with the thing in the first place? That's in essence what
what Paul posed as this theoretical problem.
Doesn't Paul say though, let God be God, don't worry about it?
The answer to the question is, who are you, O man? See? Who are we to challenge why God sovereignly does what he does?